So I would also like to express the gratitude my co-panelists already expressed to the Asfari Institute and the Arab Studies Institute, as well as everyone who has made this weekend possible. So with that, let me start. So my paper goes into much more detail of the events that I'll discuss today, as well as employs network analysis to better understand the inextricable links between the neoliberalization of the university, the decreasing autonomy of faculty and appointing professors, and the influence of donor aid on the administration's relationship with the rest of the campus community. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to discuss the forms of discrimination that we faced as a student organization, and hopefully there will be time I can discuss how I can elaborate a little bit more on how we overcame that. So when you walk, oh, I forgot to do this. So when you first walk into George Mason University, you're going to see a big banner that seems to catch the attention of everyone who passes by. Let me just get to that. So because of this banner, one might assume that historically GMU has embraced a radical political climate, but the reality is quite the contrary. We need only go back 3 years to observe the dramatic shift in discourse on Palestine and the emergence of student groups who are committed to radical politics. GMU Students Against Israeli Apartheid first formed as an ad hoc committee during Israel's Operation Pillar of Cloud. While an SJP already existed on our campus, they were and continue to be ardently anti-BDS and find protests to be too radical. So we wanted to establish an organization that would address the issue of Palestine on campus without making appeals to authority, which I would just like to point out as more of a symptom of, I think, of our geographical location to Washington, D.C., and we can talk about Beltway syndrome in an entirely different discussion, but so there's that. So come January of 2013, we had completed the required forms to become a registered student organization, and all that was left was to wait for our organization number so that we could start using space on campus. But eager to begin organizing, we accepted an invitation from GMU's International Socialist Organization to share a table so that we could start flyering and build support for our group. Now, leaving the kiosk, we felt very empowered. The student body received us very well. We were very excited to see what we could do on campus. But little did we know that that evening, that would be the beginning of our tumultuous relationship with the administration. So the administration's tactics to silence critiques of Zionism can be divided into two phases. And it's interesting that you were bringing up the soft and hard approaches because the university did something very similar. Now, excuse me. The first phase is marked by an outward denial of rights without plausible justification, just shutting us down completely and not worrying about anything after that. Now the second phase is where they began to employ policy reforms that were aimed to circumscribe our agency and reach on campus. The repressive tactics exercised during these two phases reveal a set of double standards applied to our group that are ubiquitous to groups that express criticisms of Zionism. Now for this reason, I believe it's important to examine and challenge the policy reforms that aim to centralize power within the administration, because that is what I believe creates and prohibits movement building on campus. It prohibits movement building on campus. Ultimately, though, this would pave the way for restrictive policies that would affect all student groups on campus and would actually backfire on the administration as students started to form politically conscious groups to kind of push for transparency, and they weren't necessarily for Palestine, but they were kind of seeing that this centralization of power was a problem. Now, that evening, the assistant director of student organizations emailed me threatening to revoke both the ISO's club status and our application if we continued to kiosk in the student center on the basis that we were not yet a registered student organization and did not have access to the university's facilities. Now, the assistant Director went on to inform us that this was a formal warning, and if we were to receive an additional warning, both organizations would be terminated immediately. I responded to the assistant director's email requesting where I could find the guidelines to abide by so that we could, know how to navigate the university space. Eventually, I ran into them on campus and was informed that their superior had actually received a complaint from an outside organization and assured us that this was just a misunderstanding and that they were going to clear everything up, and that she would retract the formal complaint. Now, Saya's second encounter with bias in regards to Israel manifested through the university's newspaper, formerly entitled The Broadside. The paper published 2 libelous pieces that contained blatant false statements of fact with the clear intent of defaming and dismantling our organization. And here we see the piece, and here are some excerpts, from the article. Now, by allowing articles that labeled Saya as a hate group to be published, the paper not only served to defame our organization, but it exposed Saya members to harassment and threats of violence. After threatening the Broadside and GMU with legal recourse, the paper published an edited version of our formal complaint. But this was not among our demands. We organized students and alumni against the paper and were later informed of the editor-in-chief's resignation. Interestingly enough, the next semester, the newspaper was rebranded as the Fourth Estate, and none of the articles containing Saya's name were moved to the archives. Now, the final act of discrimination we faced during this initial phase of repression was the refusal to accept our application to become a registered student organization. Despite submitting the necessary forms and attending the required trainings, the assistant director of involvement they basically just put it on freeze. So it wasn't anything concrete, but it's important to note that. Now, by the final day of that we were allowed to apply for funding, I had had enough. I basically walked directly into the assistant director's office and confronted them. Are you going to allow us to be an organization or not? And she looked kind of stunned, and I really just made it clear to the administration that it was in their best interest to have us as an organization, because then we would have to apply, we would have to follow their rules, whereas otherwise we were going to be able to just do it whatever we wanted, and you couldn't deny us anything because you're not giving us anything. They gave us our organization number. And now this would conclude the first semester of Saya as an organization, and would also mark the shift in the way the university would interact with us. From this point on, we would no longer be blatantly denied our rights without plausible justification, but the administration would administer these existing policies and enact reforms aimed to circumscribe our agency. Now, on June 19th, we had finally received the email retracting our formal warning. And in the email, the university advised us about this revision of the student handbook that I had asked for earlier, and that they would soon be sending it to me. But they made sure to warn me of 2 policies regarding their poster posting and vending, sales, and solicitation, also known as policies 1109 and 1110 respectively. Upon further investigation, we found that both policies actually serve to unconstitutionally limit the freedom of expression of both faculty and students at GMU. So, for instance, policy 1109, administered by the Assistant Vice Principal for University Services, states that posting of materials or distribution of flyers and leaflets without prior approval, as specified above, will be considered as littering and is subject to the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Additionally, the classification of unapproved flyers as trash not only restricts freedom of expression, but it allows the university to criminalize the distribution of material it disapproves of. In the state of Virginia, oh man, I'm really dry. Asif, okay. In the state of Virginia, littering is a Class 1 misdemeanor punishable by up to 12 months in jail and or a fine of $2,500. So if you can imagine, just for leafleting on campus. The policy also allows for the university to revoke an RSO's privileges or its status as a student org. Now, policy 1110 states, no use shall be permitted which is inconsistent with the mission of the university or which shall result in the undue competition with local commercial enterprises, or to further causes which are adverse to the well-being of the university. This one policy alone can be unpacked for a lot of different topics, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on it. You know, at GMU and many other universities, there aren't any established procedures that allow students, faculty, and staff to actually enact change within the university. At best, we serve as advisors to the president and the provost's office. So here, I believe there's an opportunity to hold university administrators accountable to the values-based rhetoric a lot of universities deploy about this false representation of, you know, democratic whatever and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so who holds the administrators accountable? You know, who determines what is adverse to the well-being of your university? I would argue having investments in G4S and these things don't really represent maybe the student body, but I guess university presidents might disagree. Policy 1110 requires that the distribution or solicitation of any literature or newspaper by GMU or non-GMU organizations and individuals be subject to prior authorization. These policies grant administrators unfettered discretion to censure students and faculty wishing to express dissent through the distribution of leaflets, flyers, or newspapers. This is a blatant violation of the First Amendment's guaranteed rights of free speech. Mind you, George Mason University is a public university. Our first encounter with these policies were after we had hosted a kiosk in the student center. We were warned that we were not to leaflet in front of the kiosk. But in place of filing a complaint on the content, based on the content we were distributing, the administration began to restrict the areas on campus which were deemed free speech zones. Again, I thought it was a public university. I thought all land should be, you should be able to express free speech. Eventually, the only location on campus that was not under the administration's purview was an outdoor square in the middle of campus. Being an outdoor square without any walls meant you couldn't post any posters, and that in the winter, the already arduous task of leafleting became even more difficult, and imagine a DC winter. Now, the final policy reform the administration instituted during my time affected the duration internal organizations could reserve to have their banners displayed in the various centers on campus. Now, this is a reasonable and logical policy, but it only emerged after SIA had submitted a banner. The campus, before that, the banners were advertisements to have banners. So students weren't involved. We're a commuter campus. They're always giving us funds to try to get involved, but when it comes to SIA, it's like, actually, if you don't mind, can you not be as active? And yeah. So then I think it's also important to note, I graduated George Mason 3 years ago, and before presenting today, I wanted to go on their website and see the student handbook, and you'll see it's still coming soon. It has yet to be released. So it's just funny, this is how they're able to kind of follow us. Now, the administration's policy reforms and visible application of a double standard towards the organizing efforts of SIA has had consequences that extend beyond limiting freedom of expression. By heeding to the complaints of external organizations, the administration implies that the students in SIA are not valued members of the GMU's campus community, which has led to the harassment and open threats that have been levied against us. Now, the administration's lack of a response to one event in particular, I believe, epitomizes this implicit endorsement of harassment and mistreatment. On November 5th, 2013, GMU's Israel Student Association and Camera Campus Fellow hosted an event secretly funded by Hillel entitled Our Soldiers Speak, which discussed the humanity of an Israeli soldier. Leading up to the event, the members of GMU SIA and its Camera Campus Fellow circulated comments on social media and alluded to acts of violence against SIA students and implied that they were preparing to fight us. Undoubtedly, SIA had prepared a dignified and principled action to protest the presence of an occupation soldier who boasted of his experience as a heavy machine gunner in the invasion of Lebanon in 2006. When SIA arrived to the event's venue, we were received by an excessive police presence in addition to the speaker's private security forces. We were told all types of recording devices were prohibited and that our bags must be left outside the door if we were to enter. The event started late and attendees were forced to wait in the hall while the organizers filmed and attempted to photograph our faces. When the event finally did begin, the event's organizers, including the director of Hillel, input our university IDs into an online document before allowing us to proceed into the small auditorium one by one. The practice was eerily reminiscent of my experience with flying checkpoints with occupation forces in Palestine. This tactic not only served to intimidate SIA members participating in the walkout, but it was clearly meant to frame us as a dangerous entity on campus. Now, the university's refusal to address the environment of fear and tactics of intimidation employed during this event is quite concerning for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons amongst Palestinian students participating in the protest was how would their personal information be used by the Hilal's executive director. Would he hand it over to the sergeant in the IDF? You know, how could this affect our families back home, our ability to get back into the country? In the past, this individual has publicly called on his Facebook page for students to galvanize against the hate and lies of SIA. As a university's, a staff member of the university, we must call into the question the potential abuse of his power he can have by having access to students' information. Now, in closing, I just want to kind of discuss the ways to get around these restrictions imposed upon us. I think by not succumbing to these tactics of intimidation and just showing you're going to keep doing the work, it's quite empowering, and I think that's what really has pushed other student groups on campus. For instance, I know at AUB, students aren't allowed to leaflet either on campus, you know, but are there rules in your handbook that say that you're not allowed to project onto the walls of buildings and, you know, these types of things to get away with, or to get your message across? You know, I really appreciated Tori's proposal to organize academics as labor. I think, and you know, Max and I were discussing this as well, you know, some of the ways we respond to what might seem like insignificant violations of our rights actually mirrors a lot of the ways that union organizers organize within the workplace. Every time there's a very small infraction, you make a big deal about it, you organize people against it, and that's, people will eventually start to get behind you. By not releasing the student handbook, the university is able to advance its tactics of repression through the innovation of the student movement. And this is actually happening on other universities now. So as we're developing our tactics, the university is almost in parallel finding ways to repress us for the future. And just to close, and I can talk a lot more about this, but at least at Mason, you know, the struggle of the student body and faculty, it cannot be, our repression cannot be compartmentalized. You know, a lot of students in the US see the faculty almost as in opposition to them just because of silly things like work, like the workload. But for political students, I think we need to kind of come together with the faculty, and we can talk more about that later. But thank you.